When it comes to the world of Dungeon Master advice, you can look everywhere from online forums to Reddit to YouTube itself to Twitter. You could go out and send a messenger pigeon out into a random world to ask for Dungeon Master advice, and you'll probably get back about 100,000 letters. But over the course of learning about being a better Dungeon Master over the past 7.5 years and being a part of a bunch of fandoms, Reddits, and Facebook groups, and even diving into things like my favorite Dungeons and Dragons creators like Joe Cat or XP to Level 3, and recently Jenny D, one of the things I haven't actually really seen people talk about is actually the trap that I fell into when I first became a Dungeon Master. And that is the...
Are you serious?
And that is being too nice. Now, this might seem like a weird kind of tangent to go on. Whenever you hear about Dungeons and Dragons and you hear about people talking about what the role of the Dungeon Master is, a grand majority of the community will talk about the fact that Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative effort. It is you and your friends sitting down to create a story together, and it is very much not the mentality of the Dungeon Master versus the players, right? You're not out to kill the players. But I'm not talking about things in game. I'm not talking about the way you write the campaign. I'm not talking about the encounters that you build. I am talking from the very beginning. So, in order to tell you guys about this trap, about this lesson that I've learned, I'm going to go back to the very beginning, way back in the year 2016, when I first started dungeon mastering my very first campaign. I had been playing in a campaign with this group of guys for a while, and the guy who was the dungeon master not only taught me how to play the game, but was also teaching me how to dungeon master effectively. Unfortunately, while he was a good dungeon master, he was a real old school dungeon master, which means that when it came time to me to be able to dungeon master, his goal was to completely break my game. Now, when you come across a new dungeon master and you're an experienced player, the best thing to do is to always be as easy as you can on them. I learned this whenever I was teaching my ex-wife how to dungeon master when we were still together, and I tried to build a character that wasn't like super duper powerful or had all these crazy abilities, because I wanted to give her the benefit of a doubt to where when she built encounters, she didn't have to worry about me one-shotting everything with my super powerful ranger rogue combination who could build poisons that did 10 billion points of damage. But whenever I first started doing dungeon mastering, all of the players in the campaign, except for one, had this really bizarre idea about what to do against me as a brand new dungeon master. They were all experienced players, and so their idea was to go out into the D&D Beyonds and the D&D wikis and start finding all of these homebrews to like throw together into this big mixing pot of go fuck yourself. And I approved everything. For example, this one player had wanted to do this changeling type homebrew that he had found, where the changeling every level could increase its ability score by like 3 points or some shit, and it was able to just do all this like wacky jack of all trades, master of all type thing. And I was just like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm okay with that. And the weird thing is that I had actually done this thing when I first started telling them about the game. I was like, hey guys, I think that I just want to stay with the source books. And they completely ignored that. And I said, sure. And it got to this point where I was getting so overwhelmed because the way that the way that everybody was talking to each other about the way they wanted to do things, and it was all so broken and overpowered and overwhelming, and pretty much all of it was homebrew. Again, except for this one guy who just wanted to do the source books like I had asked because he was trying to be nice to me. And I remember we were sitting around the table while they were building their characters. And one of these guys came up and he asked me if his character could start off with this bow that had like +4 damage to it at level 1. And I was like, well. And this guy, his name was Mike. He was really nice. The guy across the table, he goes, Joe, look at me. I said, yeah. He said, repeat after me. I said, okay. He said, no. And I said, no. He goes, no. He go. So I was like, no. He goes, yes, no. And he basically told me like, hey, you need to tell these people, you need to tell your players no. I said, but I don't want people to be upset and not play in my game. And he said the thing about Dungeons and Dragons players is that they want to play in your game, but they also want to do ridiculous shit, especially the more experienced players are. And this is something that I learned the longer that I played the game, is that the more experienced players become, the more bored they get and the more they want to try more outlandish shit. Right? I always had this idea in my head that players would become comfortable with what they play, and so they would continue to play the same thing, and that's not exactly true. And it also comes from me being a people pleaser. I love having friends and I love having people like me. And that is, I wouldn't say it's a bad trait, but when you're a dungeon master, you have to learn how to overcome that trait, because otherwise you're going to start letting players do things that are going to like be less fun for you. Might be more fun for them, but funness is not just an important factor for players. It's an important factor for the dungeon master. Dungeons and Dragons is this collaborative effort, as we've talked about, and the key word of that is collaboration. It is not dungeon master versus players or vice versa, but it is also not dungeon master let players do whatever the fuck they want while he stresses. When I was first sitting down to do this video and I thought about what I wanted to do for my first Dungeons and Dragons video, and I decided on this kind of dungeon master trap that I feel like a lot of people might fall into, but I've never really heard anybody talk about, I also came across the diametric opposite of this problem. Learning how to be too lenient can actually make you fall into the trap of being too restrictive down the road. As I became more and more experienced with being a dungeon master, I began to start restricting things a little bit more to kind of keep things in a nice, tight, constrained space. A lot of dungeon masters will often do things like allow you to play any race from any of the source books or any class from any of the source books, so that we can just kind of get this whole thing under wraps and we don't have to constantly be approving homebrew shit left and right, which is not necessarily a problem. It can lead to a lot of conversations, like when you have to tell somebody that no, they're not allowed to choose the super powerful mega champion class that they found on D&D Beyond, who gets a great sword that does 36 damage at level 1 and at level 2 gains the ability to commune with the gods. But I find that a lot of times you can also become too restrictive, and again, I saw this in myself. I would always get more and more restrictive with each campaign, you know, so I went from being like, yeah, you can just do whatever the fuck you want, I'll bend over while we're at it and you can just shove all your homebrew right up my ass. I also started to try to draw it in, so I'd say like only official sources only, and then people started using Unearthed Arcana, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but then I got a game where somebody used a mystic.
I fucking hate mystics.
But it started getting more and more frustrating. People started using Unearthed Arcana a lot, and they would tell me it was from Unearthed Arcana, and I'd be like, okay, cool, it's from Unearthed Arcana. And then they would just drop shit out of nowhere and be like, hey, by the way, my character can also do this, and it got really confusing. So nowadays, I just kind of ban Unearthed Arcana, and I just don't like the book. I just hate I hate the fucking book. Is that so wrong? Is that so wrong? I started restricting people outside to other source books. I was getting overwhelmed by the amount of races that people could play. So I stopped letting them use Elemental Evils and Volo's Guide. And then I started getting overwhelmed with other classes. So I was like, no, Tasha's Cauldron of everything. And you can only use the subclass, until eventually my players were basically just restricted to the core books. And that was not that fun for anyone, especially because a lot of the supplements that have been released over the years have been released in order to fix things that were, you know, kind of underwhelming or maybe too broken. So, for example, the Ranger is the most underwhelming piece of garbage in the original core book, but Xanathar's Guide to Everything released subclasses that allowed it to be more fun and engaging. And so I had to open myself back up to these things. The thing is that whenever you're a dungeon master and you find yourself getting overwhelmed with a lot of the options that your players can come up with, it might be time for you to take a step back and kind of learn a little bit more about what the game has to offer. Something I've never done before, but I'm actually hoping to do in my next games whenever I can find enough players, is to actually start running pre-mods. I've never run pre-mods before, and recently I bought the special edition of Curse of Strahd, even though I didn't like pre-mods because it was $100, but it came in a neat little coffin, and that was enough for me to relinquish more money than I honestly should have spent on it. So I'm actually hoping to run Curse of Strahd for the first time ever. And I think that this is really important for new dungeon masters because it will help you with the restrictiveness that you allow in your games. If you run pre-mods and then you say, okay, guys, we're going to use what the pre-mod allows, you learn more and more about it. And then sometimes you can slowly branch yourself out. So in the next game that you run, maybe say, okay, guys, I want you guys to only use races from Volo's Guide so that you can kind of understand how the game are. I know how to speak English, I swear! So that you kind of understand how these works. But instead of making these long campaigns with these restrictions, you make shorter ones, 1 to 3 shot campaigns, things that last just enough for you to kind of understand what is going on there. And then you can start to open yourself up to more and more. So the next time somebody rolls up and wants to play a Furbolg Oath of Vengeance Paladin, you kind of understand what is involved in a Furbolg Oath of Vengeance Paladin because you've let your players run that before. You can also do things like run test campaigns. I've done that a couple times where I kind of put together like a party of 3 characters and then I write a little mini dungeon without traps and everything, just with combat encounters, and I run these little scenarios. But maybe that's going too far. I don't know. Maybe you just want to pick up a book and read the fucking thing. Overall, if anybody has fallen into this trap of being too restrictive, I really hope that you guys found this video helpful. I really hope that you understand that you're not alone, and I really hope that you have fun dungeon mastering, DMing, whatever you want to call it, your next game. My name is Kaiser. I am YouTube's future favorite bard, and I hope you guys all have a fantastic day. Mwah. Yeah, I kind of like that. That was good.